The wind howled like a banshee, tearing at Eleanor Vance's threadbare shawl and whipping her auburn hair across her face. Each gust carried with it a sting of ice, promising a winter that would brook no arguments. Dust devils, now charged with snow, danced a chaotic jig across the desolate plains, obscuring the already fading light. It was a landscape that seemed to actively resist life, a canvas of muted browns and greys, soon to be painted over with the stark white of a blizzard. Eleanor, however, saw none of its bleak beauty. Her world had shrunk to the frantic thrumming of her own heart and the desperate, gnawing fear that tightened its icy grip around her chest. Silas. He had been gone for weeks, weeks that had bled into an eternity, each day a fresh torment of unanswered prayers and growing dread. He'd gone prospecting, chasing the glint of gold in the unforgiving mountains that loomed like jagged teeth on the horizon. A foolish, dangerous pursuit, she had warned him, her voice laced with an apprehension she couldn't shake. But Silas, with his dreamer's eyes and his stubborn spirit, had simply smiled, kissed her forehead, and promised a fortune that would see them through any winter. Now, with the first flakes of snow beginning to fall, his promises felt as hollow as the wind whistling through the skeletal branches of the few hardy trees that dared to grow here. Her meager supplies were dwindling. The woodpile, once a comforting sight, was now alarmingly low. The cabin, their sanctuary, felt increasingly like a trap. Panic, cold and sharp, pricked at her resolve. She couldn't just wait. Waiting was a slow surrender, a descent into the freezing embrace of despair. There was only one man within 100 miles who might possess the grit, the knowledge, and the sheer stubbornness to venture out into such a storm. Jedediah Stone. The name itself was a legend whispered around campfires and in dusty saloons, a man carved from the very granite of the mountains he called home. He lived alone, save for his wolf dog, Ghost, on a sprawling ranch nestled in a more sheltered valley. Stories painted him as a man of few words, his face etched with the harshness of the land, his eyes holding the stoic gaze of someone who had seen too much and felt too little. But beneath the gruff exterior, Eleanor had heard, lay a core of rugged decency. He was the only hope she had left. Strapping on her worn boots, Eleanor pulled on her warmest, if threadbare, coat. She grabbed a sturdy shawl, wrapped it tightly around her head, and secured it with a leather tie. The biting wind threatened to rip it away, but she held on, her knuckles white. She hesitated for a moment at the cabin door, her gaze sweeping over the sparse, familiar furnishings. This was her life, a life woven with Silas's laughter and dreams, now hanging precariously in the balance. Taking a deep, bracing breath that burned her lungs, Eleanor stepped out into the encroaching storm. A lone figure against the vast, indifferent expanse, her destination a distant, uncertain promise. The journey to Jedediah Stone's ranch was long, and every mile was a battle against the elements and her own mounting fear. The trek to Jedediah Stone's ranch was a grim testament to Eleanor Vance's desperation. Each step was a struggle against the wind that seemed determined to push her back, the snow that now swirled in earnest, blanketing the already indistinct trail. The world had become a maelstrom of white, the vastness of the plains pressing in on her, a suffocating blanket of cold. Her boots, sturdy but worn, offered little protection against the rising chill that seeped through the leather, numbing her toes. Her shawl, once a meager defense, was now heavy with snow clinging to her like a sodden shroud. Doubt gnawed at her resolve. Was she foolish to venture out? Jedediah Stone was a solitary man, known for his independence. Would he even entertain the pleas of a desperate widow? A stranger, when the storm itself was a formidable adversary, capable of claiming even the most seasoned frontiersman? The legend spoke of his strength, but also of his aloofness, his preference for the company of his dog over that of his fellow man. What if he turned her away? The thought sent a fresh wave of cold through her, more profound than the biting wind. She imagined Silas, his face etched with concern, trying to reassure her. "Eleanor, my love, you worry too much," he'd say, his voice a warm balm. "I'll be back before you know it, with enough gold to buy us a proper home, far from this desolate stretch." But Silas was no longer here to offer such comfort. He was out there, somewhere in the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and the silence that had followed his departure was a deafening roar in her ears. The wind whipped a clump of snow into her eyes, momentarily blinding her. She stumbled, catching herself on a scrubby, ice-laden bush. Her hands, raw and stinging from the cold, fumbled for purchase. This was foolhardy, a reckless gamble against nature's fury. Yet the image of Silas's smiling face, now tinged with the spectre of danger, spurred her onward. She couldn't let fear paralyze her. She had to try, for Silas, for herself. As she trudged through the deepening snow, a dark shape emerged from the swirling white. It was a lone rider, his silhouette barely discernible against the tempest. Her heart leaped. Could it be a ranch hand? Someone from the ranch? She raised a gloved hand, a weak gesture against the overwhelming force of the storm. The rider halted, and as he drew closer, Eleanor's breath hitched. It was Jedediah Stone, mounted on a sturdy bay horse, his face a mask of weathered stoicism beneath the brim of his hat. Beside him, a large, wolf-like dog, its fur thick and matted with snow, watched her with intelligent, piercing eyes. Ghost. Jedediah's gaze swept over her, a flicker of surprise in his usually impassive eyes. He didn't speak immediately, his silence amplified by the roar of the wind. Eleanor braced herself, her voice barely a whisper against the gale. "Mr. Stone, please, you must help me. My husband, Silas, he's gone, and I fear he's in trouble." The words, heavy with desperation, were carried away on the wind, but Jedediah's eyes, sharp and assessing, seemed to absorb every syllable. Jedediah Stone's expression remained unreadable, a testament to a life spent mastering the art of emotional restraint. The wind buffeted him, shaking his broad shoulders, but he sat his horse with an unyielding posture, a man carved from the very earth he inhabited. He studied Eleanor Vance, a small, determined figure against the onslaught of the blizzard. Her plea, though faint, had carried the weight of genuine terror. He recognized the look in her eyes, the same desperate hope he'd seen flicker in the eyes of men facing the unforgiving maw of nature, a hope that often preceded a harsh fall. He nudged his horse forward, closing the distance between them. Ghost, his loyal companion, let out a low growl, a primal sound that seemed to vibrate in the frigid air, before settling into a watchful silence, his gaze fixed on Eleanor. Jedediah reached out a gloved hand, not to touch her, but to gesture towards the direction from which she had come. "Your cabin. How far?" His voice was a low rumble, rough as granite, yet devoid of any immediate dismissal. Eleanor, shivering despite her thick coat, pointed a trembling finger back into the swirling white. "A day's ride, maybe more, sir. But Silas, he's been gone near 3 weeks. He went up towards the old mining claims, near Blackwood Ridge. The snow. It's come on so suddenly." She choked back a sob, her resolve wavering under the intense scrutiny of the rancher. I haven't heard anything. Not a word. And with this storm, I had to come." Jedediah's gaze drifted towards the distant, snow-obscured mountains. Blackwood Ridge. A treacherous place, even in good weather, prone to sudden snow squalls and avalanches. He knew the terrain. He knew its dangers. He also knew Silas Vance. A young man, a bit too eager, a bit too prone to the lure of a quick fortune, but not reckless, not entirely. Jedediah had seen him in town a few times, a hopeful spark in his eyes that Jedediah himself had long since extinguished. He looked back at Eleanor, noting the raw, chapped skin on her cheeks, the desperate plea etched into every line of her young face. He saw not just a worried wife, but a woman teetering on the brink of utter despair. His own solitary existence, while deliberate, was built on a foundation of self-sufficiency. He rarely involved himself in the affairs of others unless necessity or a deep-seated sense of duty demanded it, and this, he sensed, demanded it. The storm was growing in ferocity, and leaving this woman to face it alone after she had braved such a journey was unthinkable. He made his decision. "Blackwood Ridge is a fool's errand in this weather," he stated, his tone firm, leaving no room for argument. "But Silas Vance is out there, or was." He met Eleanor's wide, hopeful eyes. "I'll go. My dog and I know the mountains better than any storm. We'll head out at first light. It's too dangerous to try and return to your cabin tonight." He gestured with his chin towards the faint glow of his ranch, barely visible through the blizzard. "You'll stay at the ranch. Warm yourself. We'll leave as soon as the storm breaks enough to see the trail." A wave of relief washed over Eleanor, so potent it nearly buckled her knees. "Thank you, Mr. Stone. Oh, thank you." Tears, hot and stinging, welled in her eyes, but this time they were tears of gratitude, not despair. Jedediah simply nodded, his gaze returning to the oppressive whiteness of the storm, a grim resolve settling upon his features. The hunt for Silas Vance had begun. The storm raged through the night, a symphony of howling wind and rattling timbers. Inside Jedediah Stone's modest ranch house, the fire in the hearth crackled valiantly, casting dancing shadows on the rough-hewn walls. Eleanor Vance, wrapped in a thick, borrowed wool blanket, sat by the hearth, her body a mass of tremors, not entirely from the cold. The warmth of the fire was a welcome balm, but it did little to soothe the icy knot of anxiety in her stomach. Every gust of wind sounded like Silas's name whispered in her ear, every creak of the house a phantom footstep. Jedediah moved about the small cabin with quiet efficiency, his presence a solid grounding force in the tempestuous night. He stoked the fire, checked the meager pantry, and occasionally glanced out the small, frost-covered window, his brow furrowed in concentration. He said little, his words as sparse as the vegetation outside, but his actions spoke volumes. He had offered shelter, warmth, and a promise of aid, and in doing so had shouldered a burden that was not entirely his own. Ghost lay by the hearth, a dark, silent sentinel. His fur, thick and luxuriant, seemed to absorb the heat, radiating a comforting warmth. His intelligent amber eyes, slitted in the flickering firelight, occasionally met Eleanor's, a silent acknowledgement of her presence. He was a creature of the wild, his lineage a blend of wolf and dog, and he possessed an almost preternatural awareness. Eleanor found herself drawn to his quiet companionship, the unwavering loyalty that seemed to emanate from him. He was Jedediah's shadow, his confidant, and in that moment a silent witness to her fear. She watched Jedediah as he prepared a simple meal of dried beans and salted meat. He offered her a portion, his movements economical, his gaze steady. "Eat," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. "You'll need your strength." Eleanor nodded, her appetite non-existent, but she forced herself to eat, the bland sustenance a stark contrast to the gnawing hunger of her worry. As the night wore on, sleep eluded Eleanor. Her mind replayed every moment she'd spent with Silas, every whispered promise, every shared dream. She saw his eager face as he spoke of striking it rich, the hopeful gleam in his eyes. Had that hope led him to his end? The thought was a cold blade twisting in her heart. She glanced at Jedediah, who sat by the fire, his back to her, gazing out into the impenetrable darkness. He seemed to be wrestling with his own thoughts, his silhouette a study in quiet contemplation. The silence in the cabin was broken only by the roar of the wind and the crackling fire. Yet beneath the surface, an unspoken connection was forming between the widow and the rancher. She, driven by a desperate love and fear, and he, bound by a sense of duty and an understanding of the unforgiving nature of their world. He had offered her sanctuary, and in doing so had implicitly accepted the perilous quest that lay before them. As the first hint of dawn began to paint the eastern sky with a sickly grey, Jedediah rose. He turned from the window, his eyes meeting Eleanor's. "The storm is easing," he announced, his voice carrying a new urgency. "It's time to go." The silent watcher by the hearth, Ghost, rose with him, a low whine of anticipation in his throat. The search was about to begin. The blizzard, though still fierce, had lost some of its initial ferocity. The wind still clawed at them, and the snow fell in a relentless curtain. But visibility had improved, allowing Jedediah Stone to discern the faint outline of the trail leading away from his ranch. He mounted his bay horse, a creature as stoic and resilient as its owner, while Eleanor, her face set with a determined pallor, climbed onto a sturdy pack-horse Jedediah had provided. Ghost trotted ahead, his grey, wolf-like form a dark smudge against the blinding white, his keen senses already at work, probing the snow-laden landscape. Jedediah offered Eleanor a curt nod. "Keep close. Stay on the pack-horse. If you fall, I might not see you." His words were blunt, but Eleanor understood the underlying concern. This was not a journey for the faint of heart, and the blizzard was a capricious enemy, capable of swallowing a person whole without a trace. She clutched the reins of her horse, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on Jedediah's broad back. They rode in silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the rhythmic thud of hooves, and the mournful cry of the wind. The landscape was transformed into an alien world, familiar landmarks obscured by drifts of snow, trees bent double under the weight of ice. Every shadow seemed to morph into a potential threat, every drift a hidden danger. Eleanor's heart pounded a frantic rhythm against her ribs, a counterpoint to the steady beat of the horse's hooves. Jedediah rode with an innate understanding of the terrain, his movements economical, his gaze constantly scanning. He was a part of this wild, untamed land, a creature of its rhythms and its dangers. Ghost, occasionally pausing to sniff the air or the snow, seemed to guide them, his presence a reassurance. He was more than just a dog. He was Jedediah's compass, his early warning system, his silent partner in this perilous undertaking. As they ventured deeper into the wilderness, the silence grew heavier, punctuated only by the storm's relentless roar. Eleanor's thoughts, unbidden, drifted back to Silas, to the last time she saw him, his face bright with optimism. Had he been foolish to venture out, or had something else, something far more sinister, befallen him? The possibility, however faint, of foul play sent a fresh shiver down her spine. Jedediah, sensing her unease, glanced back. "We're heading towards Blackwood Ridge," he stated, his voice a low rumble. "It's rough country. The snow can play tricks on the eyes. Stick close and don't wander." Eleanor nodded, her throat tight. She trusted him. In this desolate, frozen expanse, Jedediah Stone was her anchor, her only hope. The hours stretched on, each one a test of endurance. The snow continued to fall, accumulating with each passing mile. The world outside their small, determined procession had become a vast, white abyss, and they were mere specks battling against its overwhelming might. Jedediah's resolve was a bulwark against the storm, his quiet determination a beacon of hope in the encroaching darkness. He was leading them towards an unknown fate, towards a potential discovery that would undoubtedly test the limits of his own hardened heart. The air grew colder, the snow deeper, as they approached the area Silas Vance had been prospecting. Jedediah Stone, his face grim, pointed towards a narrow, winding path that led higher into the hills, barely visible beneath the accumulating snow. "That's the way to the old claims," he stated, his voice curt. "Blackwood Ridge is known for its unpredictable weather. A storm like this can trap a man faster than a wolf in a pit." Eleanor's breath hitched. She could picture Silas, his pickaxe glinting in the weak sun, his eyes alight with the thrill of the chase, oblivious to the gathering storm clouds. The thought of him alone, trapped, sent a fresh wave of terror through her. She urged her horse forward, eager to reach the site, eager for any sign, any clue. The path was treacherous, the horses struggling for purchase in the deepening snow. Ghost, ever vigilant, scouted ahead, his low growls occasional warnings of hidden obstacles. The trees, heavily laden with snow, formed an eerie skeletal canopy overhead, their branches groaning under the weight. The silence here was different, more profound, more menacing, broken only by the insistent whisper of the wind and the crunch of snow underfoot. Jedediah dismounted, his movements fluid despite the cumbersome snow. He reached up, offering Eleanor a steady hand. "We'll have to proceed on foot from here. The horses can't navigate this terrain with this much snow." He tethered the horses securely to a sturdy pine, their breath misting in the frigid air. Eleanor followed suit, her legs stiff and cold, her heart pounding a desperate cadence. They moved slowly, Jedediah taking the lead, his eyes meticulously scanning the snow-covered ground. Ghost stayed close to his side, his nose to the ground, a furry tracker on a mission. Eleanor followed closely, her gaze darting, searching for any sign of Silas, a dropped tool, a footprint, anything that indicated his presence. The landscape felt heavy with unspoken secrets, the snow a pristine shroud that concealed its truths. After what felt like an eternity, Ghost let out a sharp bark, his body tensing. Jedediah stopped, his hand resting on the dog's head. "What is it, boy?" he murmured, his eyes following Ghost's intense stare. Eleanor's gaze followed too, her breath catching in her throat. Ahead, partially obscured by a snowdrift, was the unmistakable shape of a small, rustic cabin. It was Silas's claim cabin, a rudimentary shelter he had built himself. But something was wrong. The door hung ajar, as if kicked open in haste. Snow was piled high around it, and the chimney, usually emitting a comforting plume of smoke, was cold and silent. A chilling stillness permeated the air around the cabin, a stillness that spoke of unnatural quiet. Jedediah's expression darkened, his gaze fixed on the open doorway. "Something ain't right," he stated, his voice taut. Silas would never leave his door open in weather like this. Eleanor felt a cold dread seep into her bones, far colder than the winter air. Jedediah Stone approached the cabin with extreme caution, Ghost a silent shadow at his heels. The wind seemed to die down in the immediate vicinity of the small dwelling, leaving an unnerving, absolute quiet that pressed in on Eleanor's ears. The ajar door, a gaping maw of darkness, beckoned and repelled her in equal measure. She could feel the raw terror that had gripped Silas, or whoever had last been inside, radiating from the very timbers of the structure. Jedediah pushed the door open further, the hinges groaning in protest, the sound unnaturally loud in the stillness. He stepped inside, his silhouette framed against the dim interior. Eleanor, her heart a hummingbird in her chest, followed close behind, her eyes wide with a terrifying anticipation. The scene that greeted them was not one of a simple accidental mishap. The small single-room cabin was in disarray. A rough-hewn table lay overturned, its meager contents scattered across the floor, a tin plate, a half-empty tin of beans, a worn deck of cards. A lantern lay on its side, its glass shattered, the wick still smouldering faintly, casting a flickering, pathetic light. But it was the other details that made Eleanor's blood run cold. A heavy wooden stool had been knocked over with violent force. On the floor, near the overturned table, lay Silas's pickaxe, its handle splintered. And then Eleanor saw it. A dark stain, stark against the rough wooden floorboards, a patch of crimson that the swirling snow had not yet managed to fully engulf. It was dry, darker than fresh blood, but undeniably blood. Jedediah knelt, his movements deliberate, his eyes scanning every inch of the cabin. Ghost whined softly, nudging Jedediah's hand, his sensitive nose clearly picking up scents that Eleanor could not discern. Jedediah ran a gloved finger over the stain, then brought it to his nose. His jaw tightened. "This ain't fresh," he muttered, his voice low and gravelly, "but it's been here for a while, more than just a simple accident." Eleanor's gaze swept the room, searching for Silas, her husband. He was nowhere to be seen. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed something else, something half hidden beneath a tattered blanket in the corner, a shape, a human shape. Her breath hitched. "Silas!" she whispered, her voice trembling. Jedediah's head snapped up. He moved swiftly, his large frame eclipsing Eleanor as he approached the corner. With a swift, strong pull, he yanked the blanket away. Eleanor stifled a scream. It was Silas, or what was left of him. He lay on his side, his body unnaturally still, his eyes wide and staring, fixed on some unseen horror. His face was pale, his lips tinged blue, but there were no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle on his person that would explain the bloodstain. Yet his expression was one of profound terror, a silent scream frozen on his lips. It was a sight that would forever be seared into Eleanor's memory, a tableau of pure, unadulterated dread. Jedediah stood for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the tragic scene, his hardened features betraying a flicker of something akin to shock. The silence of the cabin seemed to deepen, the weight of this horrific discovery pressing down on them with an almost physical force. Jedediah Stone's normally stoic demeanor was visibly shaken. He knelt beside Silas Vance's body, his brow furrowed in intense concentration. The terror frozen on the young prospector's face was palpable, a silent scream that echoed in the oppressive silence of the cabin. It wasn't the grim resignation of a man who had succumbed to the elements, nor the violent finality of a shootout. This was something else entirely. "No wounds," Jedediah murmured, his voice rough with a disquiet he rarely allowed to surface. No signs of a struggle on him. But this mess. He gestured to the overturned table and the scattered belongings. Someone was here. Someone who didn't come in peace. He looked at Eleanor, her face ashen, her eyes fixed on her husband's lifeless form. He was scared, Eleanor. Terribly scared. Eleanor, despite the shock, found a surge of strength. She had to know. She had to understand. She moved closer, her gaze sweeping over the scene, her mind desperately trying to piece together the fragments of this grim puzzle. What could have happened, Mr. Stone? Who would do this to Silas? Jedediah rose slowly, his eyes narrowed as he surveyed the room again. He walked over to the overturned table, carefully examining the scattered items. He picked up the tin of beans, noting it was still half full. He wasn't starving. He hadn't run out of supplies. He then picked up the splintered pickaxe. This looks like it was used. Not for mining, but for defense, maybe. Or a struggle. He moved towards the fireplace. The embers were cold, the ashes undisturbed. No fire, not recently. This was unusual. In such a severe storm, a prospector would keep a fire going constantly. He wasn't expecting to be here long, Jedediah deduced aloud, or something drove him out, made him abandon even the fire. His gaze then fell upon a small, leather-bound journal lying partially hidden beneath the overturned table. He picked it up, his calloused fingers brushing away the dust and snow. It was Silas's. Jedediah opened it carefully, the brittle pages crackling. The handwriting was neat, though increasingly agitated in the later entries. He read silently for a moment, his lips moving, his expression growing more grim with each word. "He mentions strange noises," Jedediah finally said, his voice low. "Whispers in the wind, shadows at the edge of his vision." He thought it was the isolation, the strain of prospecting. He wrote about feeling watched. He flipped through more pages. He started to believe he wasn't alone. He mentions eyes in the darkness, footsteps outside the cabin when the wind was still. Eleanor shivered, despite the warmth of the cabin. But what? There's nothing out here but animals, and maybe some trappers. Nothing that would scare Silas like this. Jedediah looked at her, his gaze piercing. He wasn't talking about animals, Eleanor. Or at least he didn't think he was. He was terrified of something unseen. He closed the journal, his hand resting on its worn cover. This doesn't feel like a simple robbery. The violence is there, yes, but the fear, the terror on his face, that's something else. It's like he saw something that broke him. He looked out the shattered window towards the desolate, snow-covered wilderness. Something in these mountains might be more than just rock and snow. The silence that followed Jedediah's pronouncement was heavy, thick with grief, and the chilling implications of his words. Eleanor stood frozen, her eyes locked on her late husband's face. The sheer horror of his final moments, a visceral shock that was slowly giving way to a profound, aching sorrow. Silas, her Silas, a man of dreams and quiet determination, had died consumed by terror, haunted by unseen spectres in the vast, lonely expanse of Blackwood Ridge. The journal, clutched in Jedediah's hand, was a testament to his descent into fear, a chilling narrative of a mind unraveling under the immense pressure of isolation and perceived threats. But what could it be? Eleanor finally managed to croak out, her voice raw and strained. He wouldn't have been hallucinating. Silas was always so grounded, so steady. Her mind, despite the crushing weight of grief, clung to the reality she knew, the Silas she loved, the man who would never succumb to imagined fears. Jedediah ran a hand over his weathered face, his gaze distant, lost in thought. The mountains can play tricks on a man's mind, Eleanor. Loneliness, the relentless silence, the sheer scale of it all. It can chip away at a person's sanity, especially when they're hoping for a fortune that never seems to come. He paused, his eyes returning to the bloodstain on the floor. But this feels different. The overturned table, the splintered pickaxe. Silas must have been defending himself or fighting against something. And whatever it was, it left him paralyzed with fear before whatever it did, happened. He walked over to the cabin's meager supply of firewood, noting how depleted it was. He wasn't preparing for a long stay. He was either expecting to leave soon, or he was driven out of his shelter. And the storm, it came on fast. He wouldn't have had much time to react. Eleanor's gaze swept over the small cabin, now a shrine to Silas's tragic end. She noticed something then. Tucked away in a corner, almost hidden by a pile of discarded prospecting tools, a small, intricately carved wooden bird. It was a simple trinket, but she recognized it instantly. Silas had carved it for her before he left, a token of his love, a promise of his return. It was one of the few personal items he had brought with him. Seeing it there, amidst the disarray and the grim evidence of Silas's final moments, twisted the knife of grief deeper into her heart. "He was here," she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. "He was close to home, and he was thinking of me." She picked up the small wooden bird, cradling it in her palm, the smooth wood a stark contrast to the cold dread that permeated the cabin. Jedediah watched her, his expression a mixture of sympathy and grim determination. He understood the weight of her loss, the sudden, brutal finality of it, but he also sensed that their ordeal was far from over. The mystery of Silas Vance's death hung heavy in the air, a dark cloud overshadowing the desolate landscape. The journal offered clues, but no definitive answers. The scene in the cabin spoke of violence and terror, but the perpetrator remained elusive, a phantom in the storm. "We need to get you back to the ranch," Jedediah said, his voice low and steady, cutting through the heavy silence. "This place, it holds too much sorrow, and we still don't know what happened out here. Not truly." He looked out at the swirling snow, a flicker of suspicion in his eyes. "Someone or something is out there, and it might not want us digging too deep." The weight of Silas's fate and the chilling uncertainty of what lay ahead settled upon them both, a burden as heavy as the winter snows. The biting wind whipped Amelia's hair across her face as she rode, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Each gust seemed to mock her desperate haste. The image of Silas, his face pale and drawn, haunted her thoughts. She'd left him with the meager supplies, his cough a rasping testament to his worsening condition. Yet the fear that had propelled her from their isolated cabin gnawed at her. It wasn't just Silas's illness, it was the unsettling quiet that had fallen over the wilderness, a silence that felt pregnant with unseen threats. She urged her mare, Daisy, into a canter, the familiar trail blurring beneath them. The vast expanse of the Wyoming Territory, usually a source of solace, now felt immense and indifferent to her plight. The rugged beauty of the landscape, the endless sky, the distant snow-capped peaks, they were all rendered stark and unforgiving by her mounting anxiety. She clutched the worn leather reins, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the horizon, searching for any sign of life, any smudge of smoke that would indicate a ranch or homestead. Her mind replayed Silas's last words, his whispered plea for her to find help. He hadn't elaborated, his strength failing him, but the urgency in his voice had been unmistakable. It was more than just needing medicine for his fever. There was a layer of fear that had nothing to do with his physical ailment, a fear that had been brewing for weeks, a shadow that had lengthened with every passing day. She remembered the hushed conversations he'd had, the furtive glances he'd cast towards the darkening woods, the way he'd started bolting the cabin door with an almost obsessive thoroughness. She'd attributed it to the isolation, to the harshness of their new life. They had come west seeking a fresh start, a refuge from the ghosts of their past, but the land was proving to be a formidable adversary in its own right. Yet Silas's unease had felt different, more profound. He spoke of unseen eyes, of a growing unease that settled over their small patch of the world like a shroud. She had tried to dismiss his fears, to soothe him with logic and reassurances, but a seed of doubt had been sown in her own heart. As she rounded a bend, the skeletal remains of an old abandoned trapper's cabin came into view. It stood as a silent sentinel against the elements, its roof long collapsed, its timbers bleached and weathered. A shiver traced its way down her spine. It reminded her of the precariousness of their existence, how easily they could be swallowed by the unforgiving landscape. She pushed the thought away, focusing on her mission. She had to reach Marshal Brody. He was their only hope. He was a man of law and order, a bulwark against the lawlessness that sometimes crept into the fringes of civilization. If anyone could help, it was him. But the nearest settlement was still a day's ride away, and Silas's condition, she couldn't bear to think of him alone, vulnerable, succumbing to the fever or something far worse. Suddenly, Daisy whinnied, a sharp, agitated sound that made Amelia's head snap up. The mare's ears pricked forward, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. Amelia followed her gaze, her heart leaping into her throat. Through a gap in the sparse pines, she saw it, a plume of smoke thin and wispy, but undeniably there. It was coming from the direction of Silas's old hunting grounds, a place he had warned her never to go alone, a place he had been increasingly wary of in the weeks leading up to this moment. A new wave of dread washed over her, cold and suffocating. Silas had been spending more time in that direction, scouting, he'd said, but his absences had become longer, his demeanor more troubled upon his return. He'd hinted at discovering something unsettling, but he'd refused to speak of it directly. Now, the smoke. It wasn't the cheerful, welcoming smoke of a hearth. It was too small, too deliberate. It felt like a signal, a clandestine meeting. Amelia's mind raced. Was Silas in danger from someone? Had his discovery brought him unwanted attention? She knew she should ride towards the settlement, towards Marshal Brody, but an irresistible, terrible curiosity, coupled with a fierce protective instinct for Silas, pulled her in the opposite direction. She turned Daisy towards the smoke, her resolve hardening, the wilderness around her seeming to hold its breath, waiting. The smoke led Amelia deeper into the dense pine forest, a place where sunlight struggled to penetrate the thick canopy, casting long, dancing shadows that played tricks on the eyes. The air grew colder, tinged with the scent of damp earth and decaying pine needles. Daisy, usually a spirited mount, moved with a nervous caution, her ears twitching, her body tense. Amelia found herself mirroring the mare's apprehension, her senses on high alert, straining to catch any sound beyond the rustling of leaves and the snap of twigs beneath Daisy's hooves. She rode slowly, deliberately, dismounting every so often to listen. The silence here was different from the open plains. It was a watchful, brooding silence, as if the ancient trees themselves were holding secrets. Her initial thought of a friendly homestead or a trapper's camp had long since vanished, replaced by a growing unease that coiled in her stomach. The smoke was too faint, too ephemeral to be the sign of a settled dwelling. It was more like a signal, a fleeting message intended for unseen eyes. She remembered Silas's increasingly anxious pronouncements in the weeks before his illness. He had spoken of a growing unease, a sense that they were being watched. He'd taken to carrying his rifle everywhere, even within the cabin, and his sleep had become restless, punctuated by nightmares he refused to discuss. He'd been particularly withdrawn after his foraging trips into this very section of the woods. He'd returned gaunt, his eyes haunted, mumbling about shadows and whispers. She had tried to reason with him, to dismiss his fears as the product of isolation and his already frail health, but a seed of dread had taken root in her own heart. Amelia dismounted again, leading Daisy by the reins. The scent of wood smoke was stronger now, but it was mingled with something else, something acrid and metallic, like old blood. Her blood ran cold. She crept forward, peering through the thick undergrowth. Through a screen of pine boughs she saw it, a small, makeshift camp. A fire, barely more than a smolder, crackled in a pit dug into the earth. Beside it lay a pile of furs, rough and unprocessed, suggesting recent work. But it was the man sitting by the fire that made her breath catch. He was lean, weathered, with eyes that seemed to hold a perpetual glint of suspicion. His clothes were patched and worn, and a long, wicked-looking knife was sheathed at his hip. He wasn't alone. A large, wolf-like dog lay at his feet, its ears perked, its gaze fixed in the direction Amelia had come. The man was hunched over something in his lap, his movements furtive. As Amelia strained to see, he shifted, and the firelight glinted off something metallic, a piece of jewelry, a locket. It was the locket Silas had given her mother, the one she always wore, the one that had been missing since the night Silas fell ill. A cold dread washed over her. This man had it. Her mind reeled. How had he gotten it? Had he stolen it? Or was there a more sinister connection? The acrid smell, the furtive movements, the presence of Silas's locket, it all pointed to something far more dangerous than a simple trapper. Silas's warnings, his paranoia, suddenly seemed chillingly prescient. He had been more than just sick. He had been threatened. The dog at the man's feet let out a low growl, its head tilting. Amelia froze, her heart pounding like a trapped bird. Had it sensed her? She held her breath, praying she hadn't been seen. The man looked up, his eyes scanning the tree line, his expression unreadable. He said something in a low, guttural voice to the dog, which responded with another soft growl. Amelia backed away slowly, her movements agonizingly careful. She needed to get back to Silas, to warn him, but she also knew she couldn't confront this man. She needed help. She needed Marshal Brody. The image of Silas, alone and weakened, flashed through her mind. She had to be swift. She turned Daisy, her horse now sensing the urgency and moving with surprising stealth, and began to retreat, the man and his dog, and the chilling discovery of the locket seared into her mind. The wilderness, which had once been a symbol of freedom, now felt like a labyrinth of hidden dangers, and she was trapped within its shadowed embrace. Amelia rode back as fast as Daisy could carry her, the image of the trapper and the locket a burning brand in her mind. The return journey felt longer, more perilous, the shadows of the pines stretching like grasping claws. Every snapped twig, every rustle of leaves, sent a jolt of fear through her. She knew she had to get back to Silas, to make sure he was still safe, to assess his condition, and then ride for help. The thought of him alone, vulnerable, was almost unbearable. As she neared their small cabin, the familiar sight of its rough-hewn timbers offered little comfort. A knot of dread tightened in her chest. The cabin was unnervingly silent, too silent. There was no welcoming wisp of smoke from the chimney, no sound of Silas stirring within. She dismounted, her hands trembling as she fumbled with the latch. The door creaked open, revealing a scene that stole her breath. The cabin was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, belongings scattered. Silas lay on the floor, near the hearth, his breathing shallow and ragged. His face was ashen, his eyes closed, his body unnaturally still. He looked worse than when she had left him. Amelia cried out, rushing to his side, "Silas! Silas, what happened?" She gently shook his shoulder, her voice laced with panic. His eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes that were clouded with pain and fear. "Amelia, you're back," he rasped, his voice barely a whisper. "You shouldn't have gone." "Never mind that now," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "What happened? Who did this?" Silas coughed, a deep, racking sound that shook his frail body. "He found me," he whispered, his gaze darting towards the shattered window. "The man from the woods. He came while you were gone, demanded the papers." "Papers?" Amelia frowned, confused. "What papers, Silas? I don't understand." Silas tried to push himself up, but winced and fell back. "The claim papers for the land. I found something old, buried near the creek. Not just old, it was hidden. Someone didn't want it found." He coughed again, a trickle of blood appearing at the corner of his mouth. Amelia's mind flashed back to the locket, to the trapper's furtive movements. "The man I saw, the one with the dog, he had my mother's locket." Silas's eyes widened, a flicker of understanding, then renewed fear crossing his face. He's been watching us since we arrived. I saw him near the cabin a few times. He knows I found it." He struggled for breath. "The papers, they prove the original claim, the one before the railroad, before all this." Amelia's heart pounded with a terrible realization. Silas hadn't just stumbled upon a piece of land. He'd found evidence of an old, potentially disputed claim, something valuable enough for someone to resort to violence. And the trapper, the man she'd seen, was clearly involved. "He wants the land, Silas," she said, her voice hardening. "He wants to force us out, or worse." She looked around the ransacked cabin, the sheer brutality of the act chilling her to the bone. "He hurt you?" Silas gave a weak nod. He hit me when I refused to give him the papers. I managed to hide them before he searched." He gestured weakly towards a loose floorboard near the hearth. "Under there." Amelia's hands moved with newfound urgency. She pried up the floorboard, revealing a small, oilskin-wrapped packet. Inside were indeed old, brittle papers, bearing faded ink and official seals. She looked at Silas, her mind racing. They had evidence, but they were trapped. Silas severely weakened, and the aggressor knew they had it. "We have to get out of here, Silas," she said, her voice laced with determination. "We have to take these papers to Marshal Brody. It's our only chance." Silas managed a weak smile, a flicker of his old spirit returning. You're strong, Amelia. Always were." He coughed again, a dark, ominous sound. Amelia helped him sit up, her gaze fixed on the shattered window. The wilderness outside, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage. The trapper would likely return, and this time he wouldn't be so easily deterred. The fight for their lives and for the truth of their claim had just begun. The journey to Marshal Brody's office in Redemption Gulch was fraught with a tension as thick as the Wyoming winter air. Amelia had managed to bolster Silas enough to ride, wrapping him in every blanket they owned, his breathing still shallow, his face a mask of pain. She walked beside Daisy, one hand steadying Silas, the other resting on the oilskin packet containing the disputed claim papers, which she kept tucked securely inside her own coat. Her mare, usually so placid, seemed to sense the unease, her ears flicking back and forth, her steps careful. Every shadow seemed to conceal a threat, every rustle of leaves a prelude to an attack. Amelia scanned the dense pine forest that bordered their trail, her senses hyper-alert. The trapper, Silas had confirmed, was known in the region, a man named Jedediah Jed Stone, a notorious recluse with a reputation for ruthlessness. He was rumored to have a territorial claim of his own, a claim that Silas's discovered papers could potentially invalidate. The locket, Amelia realized with a sickening lurch, was likely taken by Stone when he'd initially confronted Silas, perhaps during one of Silas's foraging trips, and he hadn't returned it, using it as a silent threat. Silas, despite his weakened state, spoke in hushed tones, recounting what little he knew of Stone and his history in the territory. He confirmed Amelia's fears. Stone was a man who would stop at nothing to protect his perceived ownership of the land. He had likely been watching them since they arrived, sensing Silas's knowledge of the old claim. The ransacking of their cabin was not just an act of thuggery. It was a calculated attempt to intimidate and to find the incriminating documents. He thinks the land is rightfully his, Silas rasped, his voice strained. Been here longer than most. But these papers, they show a prior claim, one that was never properly settled. He coughed, a wave of dizziness washing over him. Amelia tightened her grip on the reins. We'll show them to Marshal Brody. He'll know what to do. He's a fair man. But even as she said it, doubt gnawed at her. Redemption Gulch was a small town, and Brody, while respected, was still just one man against a potentially dangerous and well-connected figure like Stone. They rode in near silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, Daisy's soft hoofbeats, and Silas's labored breathing. The vast, indifferent landscape seemed to press in on them, a constant reminder of their isolation and vulnerability. Amelia's mind churned with a mixture of fear and fierce determination. She thought of the life they had hoped to build here, the peace they had sought. Now it was threatened by greed and violence. As the sun began its descent, painting the western sky in hues of orange and purple, they finally spotted the distant lights of Redemption Gulch. The sight brought a flicker of relief, but it was tempered by the knowledge that their journey was far from over. They still had to face Stone, who might be watching them, or worse, might already be in town, spreading his own version of the truth. They rode into the dusty main street, the buildings appearing more ramshackle and weathered in the fading light. A few figures moved about, casting curious glances at the weary travelers. Amelia's gaze immediately sought out the marshal's office, a modest wooden building with a sign that proclaimed Marshal J. Brody. As they dismounted, the door to the office opened, and a tall, broad-shouldered man emerged, his star glinting on his vest. Marshal Brody. He was exactly as Silas had described, a man of quiet authority, his face etched with the lines of experience and integrity. He looked at them, his gaze lingering on Silas's pale, drawn face and Amelia's determined yet anxious expression. "Evening," Brody said, his voice a low rumble. "Looks like you two have had a rough go of it. Silas, you're looking poorly, and Amelia, you're a long way from home." His eyes, sharp and observant, took in Silas's condition and Amelia's protective stance. "What brings you to Redemption Gulch in such a state?" Amelia met his gaze, her heart thumping. This was it. The moment of truth. She clutched the oilskin packet, her knuckles white. "Marshal," she began, her voice steady, "we need your help. It's about our land claim, and about a man named Jedediah Stone." Marshal Brody listened intently, his gaze unwavering as Amelia recounted the events of the past few days. She described the ransacking of their cabin, Silas's injury, and the discovery of the old claim papers. She spoke of the menacing presence of Jedediah Stone, his demand for the documents, and the unsettling theft of her mother's locket. Silas, leaning heavily against the doorframe, interjected with strained whispers, corroborating Amelia's account, his words painting a grim picture of Stone's escalating aggression. When Amelia finished, the marshal remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on the oilskin packet she held. The lamplight within his office cast long shadows, deepening the lines of contemplation on his face. He then turned his attention to Silas, his expression one of genuine concern. "Silas, you need to see Doc Miller immediately. Amelia, you can explain everything to me while he attends to your husband." Amelia nodded, a sense of relief washing over her. Brody's calm demeanor and immediate action were exactly what they needed. She helped Silas into the office, where the marshal's wife, a kindly woman named Martha, was already preparing a clean, dry place for him by the stove. As Martha gently tended to Silas, Amelia sat with Marshal Brody, laying out the contents of the oilskin packet on his sturdy wooden desk. Brody examined the papers with a practiced eye. He recognized the faded seals and the archaic script, understanding the significance of Silas's discovery. "These are indeed old," he murmured, tracing a line of text with his finger. "This predates most of the current claims in this region. If these are legitimate, they could indeed create complications." "Complications?" Amelia echoed, her voice tight with anxiety. "He hurt Silas, Marshal. He broke into our home. He threatened us." Brody looked up, his expression serious. "I understand your fears, Amelia. Jed Stone is a dangerous man. He's been on the fringes of this territory for years, making a living as a trapper, but always with an eye on land. He's got a temper, and he doesn't like outsiders. He likely sees you as a threat to his own ambitions." He then explained the intricacies of land claims in the territory, how historical documents like these could, if proven valid, supersede newer claims, especially those established under less scrupulous circumstances. The railroad, he explained, had brought a surge of settlers, and not all of the original land rights had been properly recorded or honored. Silas had inadvertently stumbled upon a legal loophole, a forgotten deed. "Stone probably figured out what you found, Silas," Brody said, turning to his injured friend. "Saw your interest in that particular stretch of land by the creek. He likely believes these papers will give you an edge, and he wants to silence you or get the papers before you can use them." "He also has my mother's locket," Amelia added, her voice trembling slightly. "He took it." Brody's jaw tightened. "That confirms it. He's not just after the land. He's trying to intimidate you, to make you feel vulnerable. He probably took the locket to use as leverage, to let you know he knows you." "What can we do, Marshal?" Amelia pleaded, her eyes meeting his. "We can't let him get away with this. Silas is hurt, and our home, it's not safe anymore." Brody leaned back in his chair, his gaze thoughtful. "Here's what we'll do. Doc Miller will see to Silas. Martha will make sure he's comfortable here for the night. In the morning, we'll ride back to your cabin together. I need to see the damage firsthand and to secure any further evidence. Then, we'll head to the Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. These papers need to be officially reviewed. And if Stone has indeed violated the law, he will answer for it." He looked at Amelia, his expression firm. "It won't be easy. Stone is cunning. But you did the right thing coming here. You've brought the truth to light, and I will ensure that truth is heard." He stood, a renewed sense of purpose in his bearing. "For now, rest. You've both been through a great deal." As Amelia watched Brody's steady gaze, a fragile hope began to bloom within her. They had found an ally, a man of law and order in a wild and often lawless land. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time since she'd seen that plume of smoke in the pines, Amelia felt a flicker of genuine optimism. The fight for their future had begun, and they would face it together. The following morning dawned with a crisp, almost biting chill that promised a clear, cloudless day. The harsh Wyoming sun, a relentless orb of fiery gold, rose above the distant mountains, its early light lancing through the cool air to chase away the last lingering shadows of the night. Silas, his fever having finally broken, felt a profound sense of relief. He was still weak, his body sore and weary from the ordeal, but he was considerably more comfortable. He rested in a spare room at Marshal Brodie's modest home, the simple cot a far cry from the unforgiving ground of the forest. Martha Brodie, a woman with a no-nonsense demeanour and a heart of gold, had proven to be a comforting presence, her quiet efficiency and gentle kindness a balm to his battered spirit. She had ensured he had a steady supply of warm, nourishing broth and a quiet, secure place to recover, a sanctuary from the storm he had endured. Amelia, too, felt a profound shift. She had finally slept soundly, a deep, dreamless slumber that had eluded her for what felt like an eternity. The weight of fear and responsibility that had pressed down on her for days had lifted, replaced by a renewed sense of strength and purpose. The quiet hum of the Brodie household, the scent of fresh coffee and wood smoke, and the feeling of safety allowed her to process the events of the past few days, not with terror, but with a quiet, steely resolve. She had faced down an incredible threat, and she had emerged on the other side not unscathed, but unbroken. Marshal Brodie, a man of routine and unyielding duty, had his horse, a sturdy bay with a calm disposition, saddled and ready before the sun was fully above the horizon. He moved with a practiced grace, his hands checking the cinch on the saddle, his eyes scanning the horizon. He then meticulously checked his rifle, his movements deliberate and calm, a testament to years of experience. He looked at Amelia, his gaze steady and reassuring. "Ready, Amelia?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. "We'll ride to your cabin first. We need to assess the damage, make sure everything's secure, and then we'll head straight to Cheyenne. The sooner we get these papers to the land office, the better our chances are." Amelia nodded, a sense of quiet determination settling over her like a comforting cloak. She had faced fear, uncertainty, and violence, and she had discovered a resilience she hadn't known she possessed. The vast, untamed wilderness, which had once seemed so daunting and full of lurking dangers, now felt like a place where they could, with persistence and courage, carve out their own future. The oilskin packet, which she had so carefully guarded, was no longer just a collection of fragile papers. It was a symbol of their fight, a tangible representation of their hopes and dreams. She tucked it securely back into the inner pocket of her heavy coat, a simple act that felt monumental. The ride back to their cabin was a stark contrast to the tense, fearful journey of the previous day, with Marshal Brodie riding steadily beside her, his presence a constant source of reassurance. The towering pines of the forest seemed less menacing, their long shadows less threatening. The air, cool and fresh, was filled with the chirping of birds and the rustling of leaves. As they rode, Brodie spoke, his voice low and contemplative. He didn't just talk about the law, he spoke of the territory itself, of its rugged, untamed beauty and the hardy souls who called it home. He acknowledged the immense challenges, the harsh winters, the lawlessness that sometimes festered on the edges of civilization, but he also spoke of the inherent goodness and quiet resilience of people like Silas and Amelia, people who came to this land not to plunder, but to build and to persevere. Upon arriving at their cabin, Brodie dismounted and surveyed the scene with a grim, practiced expression. The front door, now hanging precariously on its hinges, the splintered wood a testament to Jedediah Stone's brute force, was the first thing he noticed. He stepped inside, his eyes scanning the overturned furniture, the contents of their meagre larder strewn across the floor, the general disarray that spoke of a frantic, violent search. He moved with a meticulous precision, his gaze missing nothing. He searched for any clues, finding a few discarded items that might belong to Stone, a spent matchstick, a small, crudely carved piece of wood, and a leather strap from a boot. He then helped Amelia secure the cabin as best they could, using a saw and a few old planks to reinforce the broken window, creating a temporary barrier against the elements and any further intruders. "He won't be back here any time soon," Brodie assured her, his voice firm and authoritative. "Not with me involved. He knows the law is on his trail now, But we can't risk leaving Silas alone, not yet. Martha will keep him with her until we're back. She's a good woman. She'll see to his care." With their cabin secured, they set off again, this time towards Cheyenne. The journey was long but blessedly uneventful. The vast plains stretched before them, a seemingly endless canvas of golden grasses rippling in the wind, a gentle hypnotic motion under an endless brilliant azure sky. Amelia found herself breathing deeper, the crisp air filling her lungs, the oppressive weight of the recent events slowly lifting with each mile. She looked at Marshal Brody, a man who represented something more than just the law. He was a beacon of hope in a land that often tested its limits, a promise that even in the face of greed and adversity, the truth and justice could prevail. Cheyenne was a bustling hub of activity, a vibrant, noisy place that was a stark contrast to the quiet, isolated solitude of their homestead. The streets were filled with the rumble of wagons, the clamor of voices, and the distant clang of a blacksmith's hammer. The Territorial Land Office was an imposing brick building, its large wooden doors leading into a space filled with the hushed murmur of clerks, the scratch of quills on paper, and the distinct scent of ink and aged paper. Marshal Brody, with his reputation and official standing, navigated the process with practiced ease. He presented the old claim papers, explained the circumstances of their discovery and the recent assault, and formally filed them for review. The clerk, a gaunt man with a pair of spectacles perched on his nose, took the papers with a weary sigh. "This will take time, Marshal," he said, his voice flat. "These old claims, they require a thorough investigation. Could be weeks, could be months. The wait for official verification would be long and the process arduous." But as they left the land office and stepped back out into the bright sunlight, Amelia felt a profound sense of accomplishment. They had taken the first crucial necessary step. The future of their claim and the fate of their homestead was now in the hands of the law. They had put the wheels of justice in motion, and all they could do now was wait and have faith. As they rode back towards Redemption Gulch, the setting sun cast a warm, golden glow over the landscape, painting the clouds in hues of orange and purple. Silas, having been visited by Doc Miller and given a clean bill of health for the journey back to his home, was being looked after by Martha, who had promised to keep him comfortable and safe. Amelia rode alongside Marshal Brody, a sense of profound peace settling over her like a warm blanket. "You've done well, Amelia," Brody said, his voice tinged with a deep respect. "You faced a dangerous situation with a courage and tenacity I've rarely seen in a person. Silas is a lucky man to have you by his side." Amelia smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached her eyes. "And we were lucky to find you, Marshal." The road ahead was still fraught with uncertainty. Jedediah Stone, a man driven by greed and a sense of entitlement, would undoubtedly fight their claim with every ounce of his being. The legal process could be long and challenging, a new kind of battle to be fought in the courts rather than in the wilds. But as Amelia looked out at the vast, open expanse of the territory, she felt a quiet, unwavering sense of optimism. They had faced down the shadows, not with magic or impossible, miraculous feats, but with courage, truth, and the unwavering support of good people who believed in what was right. And in this wild, untamed land, where brute force often reigned supreme, that was more powerful than any supernatural force. A new dawn was breaking on their horizon, promising not just mere survival, but the chance to build a life, a true home, and a future on the land they had fought so hard to claim. The fight was far from over, but the first decisive victory had been won, and with it a seed of hope had been planted in the rugged soil of their lives.